So the summit doesn't necessarily mean that markets are going to be open. For markets to be open, Africa has to have something to export, and we're not there yet. Africa accounts for just about 2% of South Korea's global trade. But there's room for improvement because Africa has a lot that South Korea needs. Africa's markets are growing. There's 1.4 billion people on the continent now. By 2050, 25% of people on the planet will be in Africa. So that's a growing market, and we have all the critical minerals that South Korea is going to need in order to compete with the likes of China and Japan and the United States and India. And so there's room for improvement.
Professor, when U.S. President Joe Biden invited African heads of state to come for the U.S.-Africa summit, there was a lot of concern about the agenda as a continent. Now, with South Korea, should the current head of the African Union, Kwaku Nuamah, present a common agenda for Africa in terms of trade relations with South Korea?
It's hard to produce a common agenda that speaks to everybody's needs, but there's stuff that we can agree on. So, for example, some of what has already been decided in terms of aid or in terms of support for South Korean businesses willing to invest in Africa, those things are important. You can also throw in things like security cooperation and general stuff. But the real things will be done in the bilateral sessions where individual African countries will make demands. And I think Africans should come to these meetings with a shopping list of things that they want. So, for example, South Korea wants critical minerals in Africa. Africans should demand something. They should demand support for import substitution industrialization programs. South Korea shouldn't just export cars to Africa. It should build those cars in Africa, as it does in the United States. We want scholarships for our students to go and study over there. We want technology transfer. We should make these demands. And so you're going to have the generic, watered-down communiques that are signed, but those things don't really mean much. In the bilateral sessions, African leaders should demand the things that they need for their countries.
Now, Professor, at the present time, what we know is that Korean Air flies to Nairobi, Cairo, Tripoli, and Johannesburg. But does South Korea need to kind of create or develop connections and network so that they can have direct flights straight to the African countries from Seoul in order to realize the promises being made at this very first summit between South Korea and Africa?
Well, those will be token manifestations of the relationship. What really matters is growing trade and the commitment. When those things happen, these communications will occur. You don't want South Korean planes flying to African headquarters so African elites can go on vacation. That doesn't help anybody. We want genuine economic relationships, mutual respect. And then African Airlines should also take advantage of this relationship. So there's no reason why Ethiopian Airlines shouldn't be flying to Seoul, for example. So this is a growing area, but we should demand real commitment to support and change, not token things like pretty much just having planes flying in there. Nobody's going to these places because the trade is very little at the moment.
And Professor, quickly, when you talk about those commitments, what kind of trade are we talking about here? Do you think about something like South Korea should help develop certain, infrastructure to be able to facilitate this kind of business?
Yes, so infrastructure is very important. We also want them to process things, help us process things before they import them. So, for example, African countries like Zimbabwe has a large lithium deposit. They've passed a law saying that you can export the lithium raw. And so if South Korea wants lithium from Zimbabwe, they have to help set up the factories there to process them before they import. But more importantly, they sell a lot of electronics and cars in Africa. We want to see factories in those places. Help us develop local supply chains that will help our people find jobs rather than simply dumping goods on the markets.